Good evening, my name is Eugene, and the purpose of this short tutorial will be to discuss the Black Plague, its history, and its impact on medieval Europe. Now, before we begin, the learning objectives today will be to understand the causes and how the Black Plague actually spread, the economic and religious impacts that the Black Plague had on medieval society, and understand what was the overall main impact on the lifestyle of what we know nowadays as Europe at the time when the plague was relevant. Now, before we begin discussing what the plague was, we have to actually understand what a plague is in this sense. A plague is essentially an illness, a disease which spreads over a large area, for example, and it spreads through a variety of different methods like people or animals. At that time, obviously in 1346, which is when the plague originated, there was no effective cure. There were no vaccines. Hygiene was relatively unbeknownst to the majority of the population, and it was fairly difficult for people to actually, clean themselves and obviously protect themselves from the plague itself. Now, let's discuss the origins just briefly. Now, in 1346, it is known to historians, at least to the majority of the agreed historians, is that the plague came from Italy by Italian merchants. Essentially, they were carrying rats on their ships to other parts of Europe. When they onboarded their goods, the rats also made their way onto the mainland, and thus began the period of infection. Now, at that time, it is obviously not very clear as to how the plague precisely spread because the knowledge of medicine by the local populace was not very well known, for example. So in that case, people were, essentially unbeknownst to them, the plague was spreading, and through contact with other people, with animals, for example, with farm animals, people were getting sick and obviously infecting others without understanding of how it happened. Now, obviously, rat populations, as noted here, played a very big factor in this spread because rats usually they had perfect conditions to breed and obviously to grow into large amounts of hordes and swarms across different cities, and this also contributed to the spread of this disease. Now, obviously, if you consider the main effects on the population, obviously there's no vaccines. The plague would have killed you if you got infected within maybe a couple of days or weeks, if you're lucky enough, obviously, while you will be, unfortunately, in great agony as this happened. In that situation, one of the main issues that the plague actually brought with them is that pretty much everybody died. People from the middle class, the higher class, the clergy, which is essentially the religious majority or the church, people who were working for the church. And at that time, one of the main effects of the plague was that it partially brought the forthcoming of the Protestant movement. So what people believed is that essentially God has, well, at least in their minds, forsaken them, and He sent them this plague, essentially, that would, punish people for their sins. And they actually questioned faith overall. So they believed that faith is no longer valuable to them because if they were being punished by God for their sins, what is the point of actually believing in God? And I think considering the medieval Europe was deeply rooted in religious fundamentalism, the Black Plague obviously undermined the power of the church and the crown over the medieval people, like peasants and the serfs, for example. Obviously, if you consider the hierarchy in this situation, the plague also affected the hierarchy because obviously, if people have died and obviously there were, people needed to replace them, in that situation, people started questioning the quality of their lifestyle because obviously if everybody was dying, if as they thought God was punishing everybody regardless of their social status, people eventually, as the Black Plague subsided and moved on, they believed they wanted a better lifestyle. So what happened was people, since there were less of them, obviously, they usually demanded higher wages from their serf lords. For example, people who would tax them with food supplements in that case, not supplements, but they would tax them by taking some of their food away from them. Generally, wages increased over time, which is good, so people had more disposable income. So effectively, you could argue that the Black Plague actually helped increase the size of the middle class in the medieval ages, which is obviously a very good thing. Now, in the very end, if we, for example, ask ourselves, why does this matter? Why does the middle class matter? Why does religion matter? I mentioned earlier the Protestant movement, which is essentially a religious movement founded by Luther, and he essentially denied mainstream church. He didn't like church control. He didn't really like the church controlling the people, its citizens, and he believed that people should have a connection to God without the church. So essentially, that though no tithes, no, for example, fees or taxes should be paid to the church, and people should just be religious without any connection to the mainstream organizational system of the church. Obviously, people, for example, the kings that came afterwards, who were perhaps very religious or had power over the church, they did not like this. To them, church was a fundamental, I suppose, pillar of their power. And in that case, they obviously needed to, maintain this authority. So obviously, the partisan movement, with the wars that have been fought over it, were partially because of this, because the kings and the lords and the higher social class, they always wanted to maintain power over the serfs and the medieval middle class using religion. Obviously, people began doubting themselves, began doubting their religion and belief in God because they believed they were being punished. As an example of this belief in punishment, there was a movement called the Flagellants movement, and I'll just do a quick whip here to symbolize their movement. What they would essentially do is these people, they would form caravans, they would have whips, obviously, and they would go from city to city and flagellate themselves. Essentially, what this means is they would be hitting themselves with whips on their back. And this public display of punishment, this masochistic punishment, was essentially a way to, I guess, repent in their mind. They were repenting against the sins that caused this calamity to occur in Europe. And obviously, this show of public punishment also undermined people's faith because this violent, this grotesque example of the flagellant movement to the normal person was, well, brutal. They had really big doubts about their religion afterwards of actually seeing this. But anyways, these were the main, I suppose, the main aspects of the Black Plague and its effects. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Thank you.